June 4, 1942, Midway Atoll. Eastern Island's crushed coral runway trembled under the weight of 4 Wright Cyclone engines as Lieutenant Colonel Walter C. Sweeney Jr. eased the throttles of his B-17E forward and felt the flying fortress begin to unstick from the heat-shimmering surface. He had been up since before dawn, hunched over maps and a grease pencil in a cramped briefing room where a PBY's contact report had been chalked on a board with a compass rose and a hard number. Bearing 320 degrees, distance beyond 150 miles, multiple ships, speed and course estimated by the Catalina's crew through salt-streaked binoculars. Now, with the island's low scrub slipping away beneath the bomb bay and the blue Pacific opening like a great hard mirror, he pulled the fortress into a steady climb. The crew donned oxygen masks as the altimeter's needle crept past 10,000 feet and toward 20,000, a height where the B-17's doctrine said safety and accuracy could coexist. 2 600-pound bombs swung faintly under his seat on the rack below, part of the load that armorers had hoisted with block and tackle while the wind snapped at their sleeves. To port and starboard, other fortresses from the 431st and companion squadrons took station in a lazy ladder as they formed into an echelon designed for the broad, level approach that airmen had been told would put bombs into the geometry of moving ships. Ahead, the sky was so violently clear that distances lied. The navigator called fixes. The radio operator listened for fragments of orders in the static, and the waist gunners leaned into their windows to stare for zeros that might come climbing up from carriers somewhere beyond the horizon. Sweeney's hands rode the throttles like reins. He scanned his instruments, the windscreen, and the thin line where ocean met sky. It was quiet up here, save for the vibration. And because it was quiet, he could hear the shallow breath in his mask and the small, tight sound of the bombardier keying the interphone to say he had the sight warmed and aligned. The ocean stretched flat and endless until it didn't. Smoke smudged the far air. Wakes, clean white scars, cut angles into the blue where ships moved in formation and then broke formation, twisting into long, curving S-shapes the way a snake avoids a falling stone. Sweeney leveled. The fortress steadied. The light blinked green for the bombardier. A calm voice called the checklist for the run. The pilot felt the aircraft become not an airplane, but a platform, and he held it there while the bombardier talked to himself, and the crosshairs walked toward a point of interception that the math said would be where those ships would be when gravity had finished with American iron. West and north of Midway, an armada was already in motion, the largest concentration of naval air power the world had yet seen. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's combined fleet was spread in layers across hundreds of miles of ocean, but the striking edge was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's first air fleet. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, escorted by fast battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, with a combat air patrol of Mitsubishi A6M fighters circling above like quick, bright knives. Operation MI had been drawn with the precision of a draftsman's pen. Lure the U.S. carriers out to be destroyed, seize Midway, extend the defensive perimeter, force a settlement on terms favorable to Tokyo. On Midway itself, the Marine garrison, less than 2,000 men on a pair of low islands, had spent the spring digging, wiring, camouflaging revetments, and chalking aiming stakes. When Nagumo's first strike wave roared in shortly after sunrise with more than 100 bombers and fighters, they smashed fuel tanks, pounded the airfields, and sent the island's defenders scrambling under geysers of sand and smoke. But by the time Sweeney and his fortresses were climbing, The defenders' reconnaissance had already shown the essential fact of the day. The Japanese carriers were within range, underway, turning into the wind and recovering or launching aircraft. Doctrine said that high-altitude level bombing could break the back of a fleet if properly executed. The U.S. Army Air Forces had been built on the promise of precision at altitude. The Pacific, however, was not a test range. Ships at 25 knots did not behave like factories anchored in concrete. Japanese helmsmen, trained to throw their bows across the wind at the first sparkle of falling bombs, carved evasive loops into the sea. Lookouts with years of merchant and naval experience shouted bearings and range. Zero pilots dove at intruders with an aggressiveness that had already become legend in the Philippines and the Netherlands East Indies. Even so, Army planners had faith in the fortress. 4 engines meant range, self-sealing tanks meant resilience, and Norden sights promised geometry made real. In the aggregate of the day, U.S. Army heavy bombers would fly dozens of sorties against the carrier force and its screen, dropping hundreds of bombs. After-action analysis, cold and unbeholden to hope, would find not a single confirmed hit scored by high-altitude level bombing on a maneuvering warship. Out at sea, Japanese admirals were not theorizing about obsolescence. They were demonstrating it with every turn of a rudder and every signal flag that ordered another course change at the exact moment bomb racks opened above. Sweeney's fortress rode the bomb run as if chained to a line of numbers the bombardier had laid over the sea. Flak climbed in black cotton bursts that hung like punctuation in the blue. The bursts were late, always a little late, because Japanese gunners were forced to guess and lead and adjust, but the impression was one of a ladder being hauled up toward the bomber's wings. The ship beneath his aim point looked like a cruiser, the bombardier muttered. Could be a battleship. The silhouette was smeared by distance and speed, was already heeling into a turn that saw its wake scrawl a half-moon. The bombardier's voice came soft and even, counting down through the last seconds as the sight walked its invisible line forward of the bow to account for motion. Bombs away! The B-17 rose, lightened, with the peculiar elastic feel that comes the instant after release. Sweeney held the platform steady for a long 3 count so the bombardier could watch the little constellation of dark specks become bright splashes far below. To human eyes, they always fell true. To the eye of the camera gun, and to later analysis, they fell into a sea that had just shrugged out from under them. The crew cheered anyway, reflex, relief, the need to believe in purpose. And then the fortress was an airplane again, the pilot banking to take the formation away from the heaviest flak and the stickiest knots of Zero fighters that had begun to wind upward from altitudes below. In his peripheral vision, he caught other fortresses staggered like gray gulls against the sun, each with its own string of water plumes rising like white columns and then collapsing into boil and foam. He smelled hot oil and the metallic tang of oxygen in the mask and thought, for a strange second, of the briefing room's chalk dust. The interphone crackled with reports. No hits observed, and with a few claimed strikes that the bombardier, riding the sight's circle, couldn't bring himself to confirm. They ran out the attack leg, regrouped, and pointed for Midway. While fuel was taken on in haste and ground crews checked for flak splinters in tires and control surfaces, the island's radios carried the larger action in clipped fragments. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown driving through the high thin clouds. 3 Japanese decks aflame, their aviation fuel lines turned to torches, their parked aircraft exploding where they sat. Later, a 4th carrier struck. The transformation happened in little more than an hour around 10:20 local time. But for the men who flew fortresses, it had the weight of a verdict. Carrier aviation, decks at sea, fighters on call, commanders unafraid to throw fast ships into hard turns the instant bombs began to fall, had made a whole category of attack mathematics untenable in the time it took a U.S. Navy pilot to ride a Dauntless down the last 1,000 feet to a target. Sweeney absorbed the news between refueling and rearming, and then went back out in the afternoon with another load and another calculation. Again, the sea twisted beneath him in serpents of white water. Again, the black bursts wrote their clumsy, angry script across his course. Again, the bombs fell with all the hope in the world and all the precision the instruments allowed. And again, the sea was empty where calculations said steel would be. By nightfall, the shape of the battle was fixed in the record. A Japanese operational plan undone by intelligence, an ambush sprung by 3 American carriers and a small, stubborn atoll, and 4 of the first Air Fleet's carriers sunk or doomed. In the official accounting that would be done over months by officers in Honolulu and Washington, U.S. Army heavy bombers from Midway would be credited with flying upwards of 50 sorties across June 3 to 6 and dropping well over 300 bombs against major combatant targets. Damage assessed to those bombs would be 0 against maneuvering ships, though harassing effects and strain on enemy operations would be noted with professional politeness. The fortresses had done what they were trained and ordered to do, press home-level attacks from high altitude on ships at sea, but the enemy was not obliged to cooperate with a pre-war belief. Japanese admirals had demonstrated in one afternoon what their air arm, their helmsmen, and their gunnery officers already practiced by rote. Rapid course changes, disciplined formations, combat air patrols layered to meet threats at altitude and low, and a doctrine that treated moving decks as king pieces from which offensive power could be projected hundreds of miles in any direction. The very traits that made the B-17 a masterpiece over Europe, altitude, endurance, defensive firepower, a bomb sight designed for fixed targets, translated poorly when the target was a fast, alert fleet, warned by lookouts and protected by fighters. Sweeney knew none of the post-war language that historians would use. He knew only what he had seen through the windscreen and what he had heard over the interphone and radio. Great ships that refused to be where the sight said they would be. Bombs that fell true to their geometry, but not to their prey. And in the middle of the day, a shock of news that American dive bombers had done the killing in steep, punishing attacks measured not in miles of approach, but in seconds of terror. In his debrief, he reported what his bombardier reported, careful with words, conservative with claims, because the men who flew heavies had learned in the first weeks of the war in the Philippines and Java that wishful thinking made for bad arithmetic. Still, as he walked away from the operations tent under a sky turned orange by fires far off the horizon, he understood he had been present at a turning. Others would call the battle a miracle for the U.S. Navy. For a heavy bomber commander, it was a different kind of miracle. A sudden, authoritative proof that the Pacific would be a carrier war, fought by squadrons launched from moving decks and finished by weapons dropped from altitudes where accuracy could be wrung from a dive and not trusted to the elegant lines scratched by a bomb sight on a map. They woke him twice that night to recheck figures that would go into the preliminary report. And each time Sweeney swung his feet to the floor of the hut and felt the grit of coral dust and the weight behind his eyes from too little sleep and too much clear sky. The operations officer wanted to be certain about headings on the bomb run and the approximate altitude at release. The intelligence captain wanted to be certain he had heard Sweeney correctly when he said that the Japanese ships had begun their turn before the bombs were in the air. The questions were polite but pointed, and they forced Sweeney to replay in slow motion what had already looped through his own mind. He remembered the carrier that had seemed to slide sideways, as if skating on the sea, the white wake curving, the bombs falling into water where steel had been seconds earlier. He remembered the bombardier swearing softly, not in fear but in irritation, as the ship refused to sit still inside the crosshair circle, and the knowledge in that voice that the math could not hold if the target behaved like a live thing instead of a fixed coordinate. When they finally let him go, he lay back on his cot and listened to the distant mutter of guns on Midway and the closer cough of generators that kept the island's few lights burning under blackout shields. His crew slept around him in their sweat-darkened T-shirts. On the wall, someone had tacked the day's situation map, with pins for Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, and then, hastily, grease pencil crosses. He closed his eyes and saw again the clean fall of his bombs, beautiful in its own way, and the emptiness where they struck. In training, the fortress at altitude was a problem the enemy could not solve. Out here, for the first time, he felt like the problem belonged to him. The larger story that had unfolded over that same day was already being framed in telegram prose between Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters and Washington. Midway would enter history as the turning point in the Pacific War, the moment 4 of Japan's frontline carriers were lost, more than 300 aircraft destroyed, and an elite cadre of aviators killed or scattered. Behind those numbers sat a set of tactical realities that mattered directly to Sweeney's profession. Japanese admirals, Nagumo on the spot and Yamamoto further back, had trained their formations to respond instantly to air attack. Combat air patrol fighters were stacked at multiple levels, cued by shipboard radar that was limited but improving and guided more often by veteran lookouts who could pick a glint at 30 miles. As soon as bombers were sighted at altitude, ships turned toward or away from the threat, shifted speed, and altered course in rhythmic patterns meant to spoil the simple bomb run that the United States Army Air Forces had drawn on classroom blackboards throughout the 1930s. In the China and Philippines campaigns, Japanese surface commanders had already seen that high-flying bombers could be evaded by prompt helmsmanship. At Midway, they proved the rule under the most intense pressure yet, against some of the best crews in the USAAF. Statistical summaries that would reach the Army Air Force's staff later in the summer recorded that dozens of B-17 sorties from Midway and Choshan, Hawaii had dropped many tons of explosives against the invasion and carrier forces without scoring a confirmed direct hit on a major warship, while the Navy's dive bombers and torpedo planes, at terrible cost, had found and destroyed the carriers with point-blank attacks. The conclusion did not require academic language. It was written in the smoking hulks of 4 Japanese carriers and in the untouched wakes of ships that had danced away from high-level bombardment. Japanese admirals had not sat in lecture halls in Maxwell Field, but by the way they fought off those attacks, they ended a theory. Morning on June 5th brought Sweeney a pale, hard light and another briefing, this time more methodical, less frantic, focused on searches for damaged enemy units retreating to the northwest. The room smelled of coffee grounds and damp wool. On the board, an intelligence officer traced probable routes of withdrawal, talked about crippled cruisers and oilers, about the possibility of finishing blows. Sweeney studied the plots and thought in simple terms. Distance, load, fuel. The fortresses could range far. They could carry enough to break a wounded ship's back if they could find her. They took off again, climbed to their usual heights, and swept the quadrants directed by Midway control. Somewhere out there, the heavy cruiser Mikuma was bleeding from earlier strikes. Somewhere, escorting destroyers watched the horizon for more attackers. Sweeney sat in his armored seat and felt the familiar thrum of 4 engines and the familiar isolation of height. When they finally found ships, their silhouettes small and dark against the sea, he went through the old routine, the one he could do almost without spoken words. Level, trim, turn over to the bombardier, hold straight while the crosshairs walked. Watch the enemy begin to scurry under him in predictable, practiced curves. Bombs away. Tall pillars of water leaped up. Again, as after the first day, there would be after-action claims and counterclaims. Patrol crews and bomber crews believed they had hit. Japanese records later would show how many bombs missed. What mattered to Sweeney, sitting through debriefings that evening under bare bulbs, was the pattern in his own memory. Each time their bombs fell where doctrine said they should, the enemy was already not there. It was not a failure of courage. It was not cowardice in the face of flak or fighters. It was something colder. At high altitude, against fully alert maneuvering ships, the Flying Fortress was being outplayed. Across the Pacific and in Washington that summer, staff officers and analysts built those impressions into documents that would direct where Sweeney and his aircraft went next. Heavy bombers had been a proud centerpiece of American air power theory before the war, their advocates promising that formations at altitude could smash industry, cities, and fleets. The early months of the conflict had already begun to erode that faith when B-17s failed to prevent Japanese landings in Malaya and the Philippines, and landed hits only rarely on active shipping during the desperate retreat through the Dutch East Indies. Midway settled the argument among professionals who were willing to look at numbers. Fast carrier task forces commanded by admirals who understood air power as mobile offense had demonstrated that the most decisive blows at sea were now delivered by aircraft that could come in low or in steep dives, target individual hulls within seconds, and work hand in glove with fighters and scouts under the flexible control of a carrier deck officer. Japanese admirals had refined that system from Pearl Harbor through the Indian Ocean raids, and even in defeat at Midway, their method of defending the fleet against high flyers had been efficient. When American naval aviators turned the same method back on them, the result was catastrophic. In internal memoranda, Army Air Forces planners began to shift the role of B-17 groups in the Pacific away from precision attack on mobile fleets and toward long-range reconnaissance, harassment, and strikes against fixed or limited mobility targets, such as bases, harbors, and industrial installations. Men like Sweeney found their squadrons reassigned to the South Pacific, to New Caledonia, Espiritu Santo, later to New Guinea and the Solomons, where Japanese shipping lanes feeding Rabaul, Lai, and Bougainville became their quarry. They flew from coral strips at Espiritu Santo or Townsville, across open water to bomb anchorages and airfields. At times they scored telling hits on transports and cruisers caught in confined waters. Yet even there, when attacking destroyers or fast freighters in open sea, the old Midway lesson repeated itself. Japanese skippers, drilled to throw the rudder hard over at the first sight of falling bombs, could still spoil the calculated pattern. For Sweeney, the war had become a long series of missions that proved his aircraft was still useful, still necessary, but no longer the weapon that theory had promised. Out on the open ocean, Japanese admirals and ship captains had made the truth plain in a few fierce days in June, and every mission afterward only underlined it. Sweeney's unit left Midway in late June. A convoy of fortresses escorted partway by PBY Catalinas and then alone across open water to Oahu. The journey took most of a day, the Pacific vast and indifferent beneath them, each hour marked by fuel checks and position reports transmitted in clipped Morse through a thin crackle of static. When they landed at Hickam Field, the ground crew greeted them with the matter-of-fact efficiency of men who had seen squadrons arrive battered and leave again within weeks. The salt and coral dust were washed from the engines, the guns re-oiled, the bomb sights recalibrated. Briefings resumed almost immediately, this time in cooler, larger rooms lined with maps of the entire Pacific Arc. The intelligence officers talked about Rabaul, Truk, and the Solomons, about the slow crawl of bases being built and airfields carved from jungle. Sweeney listened, recognizing that his war was being redrawn from the air down. He studied the new target lists, which spoke of harbors and warehouses instead of fleets, and knew the reason without being told. The same aircraft that had failed to strike moving carriers would now be turned against fixed supply centers. The crews accepted it without argument. The fortress was still needed, but its role had shifted. When they flew practice runs out of Oahu, Sweeney could feel the change even in the tone of the debriefs. The questions were about coverage, endurance, and weather, rather than bomb pattern accuracy. The men joked that they had become the Navy's eyes rather than its hammer. In Tokyo, the lesson had also been absorbed, but in a different register. Reports from surviving ship captains at Midway reached the Imperial General Headquarters within days. The naval staff dissected every phase of the engagement with the precision of surgeons, noting the lethal accuracy of American dive bombers and the comparative ineffectiveness of high-altitude attacks. Japanese naval aviation had already emphasized coordination, speed, and training. But Midway confirmed that decisive combat would now revolve around carrier air groups, not ship artillery or fleet bombardment. While American planners redefined the flying fortress, Japanese admirals redoubled their commitment to the doctrine that had just nearly succeeded. The concentration of mobile carriers able to project power hundreds of miles. Yamamoto's analysts compiled tables of aircraft losses, ship damage, and enemy strength, and concluded that Japan must build replacements faster and train pilots harder if it hoped to regain initiative. The B-17, which had loomed in early war propaganda as the symbol of American industrial reach, scarcely figured in those assessments. It was already seen as a weapon of the past, powerful but poorly matched to the tempo of naval warfare in the Pacific. By the time the formal Japanese after-action studies were filed that autumn, they treated the flying fortress as a secondary nuisance compared with carrier-borne bombers and submarines that hunted convoys in the home waters. A whole class of adversary aircraft had been rendered strategically obsolete in a single campaign, and the Japanese knew it as clearly as the Americans did. Sweeney's new orders came on July 10th. His group was to redeploy to Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides, part of the buildup for operations aimed at Guadalcanal. The flight south was long and broken into hops through Canton Island and Fiji, each stop an illustration of the reach of American logistics. Every island bristled with Seabees, engineers, and cranes unloading cargo from Liberty ships. He saw the same cranes that had astonished German prisoners a world away, steel arms swinging with easy power, moving supplies for another kind of war, the moon. Airstrips were fresh cut, the tents arranged in neat lines, and the smell of gasoline hung over everything. When they landed at Espiritu Santo, the humidity wrapped around them like a wet cloth. The airfield was barely finished, and at night generators hummed in rhythm with insects. From here, they were told, the fortresses would range out across the Solomon Sea to strike Japanese shipping lanes and harbors. It was a new kind of mission, less grand than Midway, more practical. They would not be facing entire fleets, only convoys and small task forces bringing men and material to the front. On his first sortie over Bougainville, Sweeney looked down at the narrow blue corridors between the islands and thought how different this was from the geometry of the Midway sky. Below him were real targets that could not dance away, ships hugging coasts and rivers, barges creeping between coves. The bombs fell through humid clouds, exploded along a wharf, and left fire where it could spread. The debrief that night recorded hits. It felt almost like redemption, though he knew it was not the same kind of war. Back in the United States, factories in Seattle, Wichita, and Long Beach kept turning out fortresses in numbers that filled hangars and overflowed runways. Production statistics reached the Pacific through mimeographed newsletters and dispatches. Hundreds of aircraft a month, thousands of engines, new models with heavier armor and longer range. The numbers were a comfort to men like Sweeney, proof that they were part of something immense, but they also underscored the changing purpose of their machine. Reports from Europe described the 8th Air Force forming in England to carry the strategic bombing offensive against Germany. That was where the Flying Fortress would reclaim its doctrine, against cities and industrial centers that could not turn and run. In the Pacific, the Army Air Forces were experimenting with the new B-24 Liberator, which could fly farther and carry more, better suited to the long overwater missions that now defined the theater. By August, the first B-24s had begun to replace the older fortresses in Sweeney's command. He supervised the transition, helping crews learn new checklists, new performance quirks. The shift felt inevitable. The men had come to respect their aircraft deeply, but they could not deny the direction of progress. Sweeney watched the first Liberator climb into the tropical sky, its twin tail catching the morning light, and understood that the cycle was complete. Midway had not only marked a victory for the United States Navy, it had quietly written the end of his airplane's dominance. What he had learned in those few days above the Pacific would follow him through every later mission, a permanent reminder that in war, invention and obsolescence traveled together, and sometimes both arrived on the same afternoon. The campaign for Guadalcanal began before Sweeney's squadron had fully settled into its new field. On August 7, 1942, Marines landed on the beaches of that island and on nearby Tulagi, and the long contest for the Solomon chain began. From Espiritu Santo, Sweeney watched the logistics of invasion unfold. Streams of C-47 transports ferrying men and supplies, cargo ships unloading under camouflage nets, and the constant sound of engines as fighters and dive bombers flew north to support the beachhead. The B-17s joined those efforts in their own way, flying reconnaissance sweeps at dawn and dusk, and bombing Japanese shipping off Rabaul, Buin, and Shortland Harbor. The missions were long, sometimes 10 hours, with the sea monotonous beneath and cumulus clouds building into towers that forced detours of dozens of miles. At altitude, the temperature dropped enough for frost to rim the oxygen masks. When they found targets, Sweeney followed the same routine he had learned at Midway. Altitude, course, release, and then the wait to see if the bombs struck. Most times they did not. Japanese destroyers and transports were still agile, still alert, their captains weaving across the water as soon as the silver dots of fortresses appeared above them. When hits did occur, they were usually on ships caught in harbor or anchored for unloading, victims of bad luck rather than American precision. The crews returned with salt haze on their turrets and oil on their cheeks, claiming what damage they could prove with photographs. To the men on the ground, the fortresses were part of the rhythm of war, their takeoffs and landings marking the days and nights like the tides. The wider war that summer turned the Pacific into a landscape of logistics. American factories were feeding the effort with a scale of output that dwarfed anything seen before. In 1942 alone, over 4,000 flying fortresses rolled off assembly lines. The figure impressed even the enemy. Japanese intelligence estimated American aircraft production at 10 times Japan's own capacity, and it was not far wrong. Every shipload of crated engines and spare parts that reached the South Pacific made it possible to replace what was lost in days instead of months. Yet for all that, the fortress remained a secondary weapon in the island war. Sweeney's sorties grew repetitive. He kept meticulous notes in a small notebook, recording date, target, altitude, and results. There were few results to record. He began to measure success by survival. They flew through tropical storms that shook the aircraft like toys, through flak bursts that left holes the size of fists in the fuselage, and through nights when lightning crawled across the wings like veins of fire. Each mission brought the same question whispered over the interphone. Would anything they did make a difference? The answer, increasingly, was found not in the sky, but in the slow advance of Marines and Seabees pushing north through the islands, building airfields closer and closer to Japan's ring of defenses. By early 1943, Sweeney's group had moved again, this time to Port Moresby, supporting the New Guinea campaign. The pattern repeated: long flights, scattered targets, small damage. He saw the new B-24s arriving in greater numbers, their crews fresh from training, their bomb bays deeper and their wings longer. He respected their reach but missed the solidity of the fortress, the sense that it could take punishment and bring him home. The younger pilots regarded him as one of the old hands, the Midway veteran who had flown into the teeth of the Japanese fleet. Sometimes they asked about that day, about what it had been like to attack carriers from high altitude. He told them the truth without bitterness. The ships were small, the ocean was wide, and bombs did not bend to will. The story carried its own moral. The young men listened, nodding, and then went out to test their own luck over Rabaul or Wewak, where Japanese fighters still rose in tight, disciplined pairs to meet them. The air war had changed, but the discipline of the enemy had not. In Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto still believed he could wear the Americans down through attrition, though his fleets were shrinking with every month. When Yamamoto was killed in April 1943 after American codebreakers traced his itinerary and fighters intercepted his plane over Bougainville, Sweeney read the news tacked to the mess wall and felt only a dull symmetry. The admiral whose doctrine had rendered his own aircraft obsolete had now been undone by a different kind of air power, one that hunted men instead of fleets. That summer, as Allied forces moved through the Central Pacific, the role of the flying fortress finally contracted to reconnaissance and anti-submarine patrols. Sweeney's logbooks filled with entries that read more like Coastal Guard reports than combat records. They carried cameras instead of full bomb loads, watching for periscopes or the gray shapes of surfaced submarines. The crew learned to recognize the pattern of wakes and the thin smoke of diesel engines. On good days, they found nothing. On bad days, they dropped depth charges and circled the spreading oil slicks that marked another small victory. The war had shifted north toward the Gilberts and Marshalls, where new aircraft and tactics were taking over. By late 1943, Sweeney's orders sent him back to Oahu to train new crews. He arrived to find the runways crowded with bombers waiting for Europe. The noise and energy of it all reminded him of Midway's first hours, though the stakes were now different. As he stood beside a new crew briefing for their first trans-Pacific flight, he realized that his own journey had come full circle. The fortresses would go on to make their legend over Germany and France, while in the Pacific they would fade into history. The Japanese admirals who had outmaneuvered them at Midway were mostly gone, their fleets sunk, their bases bombed to rubble. Yet in a way, their legacy lingered in every carrier deck now filling the horizon. Sweeney understood it better than most. They had taught the world how air power truly ruled the sea. Sweeney's reassignment to training duty at Hickam Field in 1944 placed him in a world that seemed almost removed from the one he had known at Midway. Every morning, new crews lined up in fresh uniforms, their aircraft engines turning over in the tropical sun, their laughter loud and careless in a way that only men untouched by combat could manage. He stood before them during briefings, a tall figure with the faintly graying hair of someone who had learned patience through repetition and spoke in the measured voice of experience. He taught them not about heroics, but about survival, how to trim a fortress for long flights over water, how to read cloud shadows on the ocean, to judge wind direction, how to spot ships against the horizon before the ships spotted them. He talked about discipline, navigation, and the small rituals that kept a crew functioning under strain. Yet, beneath the technical advice, his lessons carried another message, one not written on any manual. When he described the Battle of Midway, he did not glorify it. He spoke of the empty ocean, of bombs that fell true but uselessly, and of the Japanese admirals who had turned his aircraft into relics before the war had even reached its midpoint. His students listened in silence. To them, Midway was history already, something in the background of the great campaigns that were now rolling toward the Philippines and beyond. Beyond Hawaii, the war had entered its industrial phase. The U.S. Navy's new Essex-class carriers and fast battleships were sweeping west, their decks alive with aircraft that dwarfed the scale of anything Nagumo or Yamamoto had commanded. Carrier-based Hellcats and Avengers dominated the skies, while long-range B-24s and B-29s began hammering Japan's industrial heartland from the Marianas. Sweeney followed the progress through operations bulletins and maps pinned to the walls of the operations office. The numbers were immense. In 1944, the United States produced more than 96,000 aircraft, including thousands of heavy bombers and fighters. By contrast, Japan managed barely a tenth of that figure. What the Japanese admirals had understood in 1942 had now become undeniable. Control of the air decided everything. When American carriers struck Truk in February 1944, they did in 2 days what high-altitude bombers could never have done: crippled an entire fleet at anchor, sinking 40 ships and destroying more than 200 aircraft. Sweeney read the after-action reports and felt both admiration and melancholy. He recognized the tactics, the precision, the timing that had been born in the lessons of Midway. He saw, too, how the flying fortress had given way to aircraft that attacked not from miles above but from within the reach of the enemy's guns, guided by control officers who could change targets within seconds. The new war belonged to them. Late in 1944, Sweeney was sent to Saipan as part of a small liaison team advising B-29 units arriving for the first raids on Japan. He was there not as a pilot, but as an observer, part of a bridge between generations of aircraft and tactics. The B-29 superfortress was everything the B-17 had promised, and more. Pressurized cabins, remote-controlled guns, and a range that could carry 10 tons of bombs from the Marianas to Tokyo and back. Watching one lift from the runway at dawn, its 4 engines leaving shimmering trails in the humid air, he felt the old mixture of pride and distance. The war had accelerated past him, yet he could see the same lineage running through the new machines, the same faith in altitude, endurance, and precision. When the first raids burned Tokyo, he noted how the press releases spoke of accuracy, of industrial targets destroyed. He knew, however, that fire and mass, not precision, were the real weapons now. Cities, not ships, were the targets that could not turn aside. The Japanese admirals who had once outmaneuvered his bombs were gone, but their successors watched helplessly as the weight of American industry fell from the sky in a storm that could not be dodged. As 1945 began, the war was drawing to its violent close. The Navy had advanced to Okinawa. The Army Air Forces were turning cities to ashes. In March, Sweeney received word that he was to return to the mainland for reassignment. He flew east across the Pacific he had first crossed 3 years before, now covered in the wakes of convoys and the contrails of aircraft. From the air, he saw the transformation. Islands that had once been lonely dots of coral were now covered with runways, fuel tanks, and radar masts. When he landed in California, the air was thick with the sound of production and victory. In July, when news reached him that the war was effectively over after the atomic bombings, he sat for a long time in the officers' mess, staring at a map of Japan. The fortresses had been obsolete for 3 years, but in spirit, they had started something that ended in those final explosions. They had tested the reach of air power against fleets and cities alike. They had failed at Midway and yet succeeded in proving what would come after them. He wrote a short note in his journal before closing it for good. The Japanese made us see the truth. The flying fortress was never weak. The world had simply changed. In the months that followed Japan's surrender, Sweeney found himself in an America that seemed both familiar and unrecognizable. The victory parades rolled through cities that glowed at night with more light than all of wartime Tokyo and Berlin combined. Factory chimneys that had once poured out smoke for war now produced refrigerators, tractors, and automobiles. The airfields were filled with mothballed planes lined in endless rows under the sun, their engines sealed and their wings wrapped against weather. Among them stood B-17s, some still gleaming, others streaked with rust from Pacific rain. Sweeney walked among them one afternoon at Kingman Army Airfield in Arizona, where hundreds waited for the scrap dealer's torch. He traced his hand along the fuselage of one and felt the faint ridges of its rivets under the dust. This was the machine that had once been the symbol of American might, the flying fortress that promised to take war out of reach of the sea. Now it sat silent, a monument to lessons learned at terrible cost. He thought of the Japanese admirals who had forced that lesson in a few hours at Midway, and of the thousands of men who had flown, fought, and died to perfect what those admirals had revealed. That air power had to be flexible, immediate, and close to its target. The official histories began to appear in 1946. The Army Air Forces published thick volumes of reports, maps, and tables. Sweeney read the summaries like scripture. They confirmed what he had felt that June morning in 1942. Not one confirmed hit by a high-altitude bomber on a Japanese warship during the Battle of Midway. He underlined the line in pencil. Below it, he wrote simply, "We learned." The historians also recorded how those same Japanese fleets, once untouchable by level bombers, were later destroyed in harbors by dive bombers, submarines, and carrier strikes. The irony was not lost on him. The doctrine that the Imperial Navy had used to make his mission impossible had also sealed its fate. Once the United States mastered the same combination of speed, coordination, and proximity, Japan's great fleet had no defense. The numbers told the rest of the story. Between 1942 and 1945, Japan lost more than 70% of its merchant tonnage and nearly all of its major warships. Air power had triumphed, but in a form that owed its evolution to the very men who had humiliated Sweeney's generation of fortress crews. By 1947, Sweeney was back in uniform, but in a different capacity. The Army Air Forces had become the United States Air Force, a new branch born from the conviction that air power alone could now decide wars. He attended the first symposium at Maxwell Field that year, where generals and engineers spoke about the atomic age, jet propulsion, and global reach. In one session, a young officer presented on lessons of the Pacific War for future strategic operations. The slides showed Midway, Rabaul, and Tokyo, each a step in the transformation of aerial warfare. The presenter pointed out how early assumptions about high-altitude bombing against fleets had failed, and how carrier aviation had bridged the gap between theory and practice. Sweeney listened quietly. When the officer finished, he stood up and asked one question. "Do your men know why those assumptions failed?" The room fell silent. "Because we believed ships would behave like cities," he said. "They didn't. They could move, and their admirals knew exactly how to make them move. We learned too late." Afterward, presenter approached him and asked what he would tell new pilots. Sweeney smiled faintly. "Never assume the target will sit still," he said, "and never underestimate the man who can make it move." As the years passed, the B-17 became a museum piece, a relic of a heroic age. Sweeney visited the Smithsonian's restored fortress in 1952. It gleamed under spotlights, polished and perfect, the paint fresh, the bomb bay open for tourists. Children pressed against ropes to see inside. He stood apart, listening to a guide describe the aircraft's range, armament, and strength. When someone asked if it was ever used in the Pacific, the guide hesitated and mentioned briefly the early missions from Midway. Sweeney felt a small, private satisfaction that the story still lived, even in passing. He left before the tour ended, stepping out into the afternoon light, the sound of jet engines echoing from a nearby runway. The future was already airborne in silver-swept wing shapes that could cross oceans in hours. He looked up, following their contrails until they vanished, and thought of that morning above the Pacific when 4 Japanese carriers had turned beneath him and vanished from his bomb sights. In that instant, the old world had ended. Everything after was consequence. Sweeney's last posting before retirement took him to the Pentagon in 1955 as an advisor on air strategy. The corridors there smelled of polish and paper, and every wall seemed covered in charts projecting the next war into the stratosphere. Generals spoke of missiles, supersonic jets, and deterrence. In conference rooms lined with maps, he listened as planners described nuclear delivery systems with the same faith that his own generation had once placed in the flying fortress. The words had changed: megaton, guidance, payload, but the certainty was the same. He watched young officers speak confidently of perfect accuracy, of war reduced to mathematics. He never interrupted, but afterward, over coffee, he told one of them a story. He described June 4th, 1942, the sunlight over Midway, the dark ships that could turn faster than bombs could fall, and the sudden realization that theory and reality never matched. The officer nodded politely, perhaps not understanding that Sweeney was giving him a warning, disguised as memory. By then, Japan had rebuilt from ruins into a country of neon signs and factory skylines. American air bases dotted its islands, and the aircraft that once leveled its cities now stood as allies on its runways. Sweeney visited in 1957 as part of a delegation studying post-war aviation cooperation. He flew into Tokyo and looked down on the city lights that stretched endlessly, a sight that no Japanese admiral could have imagined in 1942. At Haneda, Japanese officers greeted him with crisp salutes and fluent English. In Yokosuka Harbor, he saw American carriers moored beside destroyers flying the rising sun. The irony was quiet but powerful. The nation whose admirals had made the flying fortress obsolete had itself become proof of how war's lessons could turn enemies into partners. In briefings, Japanese officers spoke of coordination, efficiency, and industrial precision, the very things their predecessors had demonstrated with deadly mastery. Sweeney realized he was hearing echoes of Nagumo and Yamamoto, translated into the language of peace. One evening, he visited a small maritime museum near Yokohama. In one corner stood a scale model of the carrier Akagi, the ship that had once slipped beneath his bombs. The placard described its history, its triumph at Pearl Harbor, and its loss at Midway. Children pressed close to see the miniature aircraft on its deck. Sweeney stood behind them and remembered how that real deck had looked from 6 miles above, tiny, distant, almost harmless. He thought of the men aboard, sailors and pilots who had done their jobs with the same discipline he had admired in his own crews. There was no bitterness left in him, only a quiet sense of connection across time. When he signed the museum's guest book, he wrote a single line beneath his name. "I saw her once far away. She taught us more than we knew." He retired the next year to a small house outside Seattle, within sight of the Boeing field, where the first fortresses had been built. Sometimes he drove there just to watch the new aircraft lift off. Jets now, sleek and almost silent compared to the roar of the 4 Wright Cyclones he had once trusted with his life. The world had grown faster, the sky more crowded, but the lessons remained. He kept one relic from his service, a single switch plate from a B-17 cockpit, engraved with the word "Release." It sat on his desk as a reminder of the day he pressed it and learned how quickly history could change. On quiet evenings, he would write letters to former crewmen or read the latest news about aviation and think about the strange balance of it all, the admirals who had rewritten warfare, the airplanes that had outlived their purpose, and the men who had lived long enough to understand both victory and obsolescence. In the end, the story of the Flying Fortress was not about failure or triumph. It was about discovery. In one afternoon above the Pacific, Sweeney had seen the old world vanish and the new one begin, carried on wings of steel and illuminated by the hard, clear light of truth.